The sun had barely risen over the quiet suburban street of Willow Creek, casting a golden glow on the perfectly trimmed lawns and the pastel-colored houses that lined the road. But inside the Thompson household, the morning was anything but peaceful. 12-year-old Emily Thompson, a bright-eyed, wheelchair-bound girl with a radiant smile that could light up even the darkest day, was humming softly to herself as she arranged her collection of stuffed animals in the corner of her sunlit bedroom. Her mother, Linda, bustling around to prepare breakfast while her father, Mark, sat at the kitchen table scrolling through the neighborhood online forum, a frown slowly forming on his face as he read another complaint from the notorious HOA chairwoman, Karen Whitmore, a woman whose reputation for being overbearing and relentless had spread through the community like wildfire, a name that, to anyone who had ever crossed her path, was synonymous with fear and intimidation. Emily, oblivious to the brewing storm, continued her morning ritual, her small hands delicately brushing the soft fur of her favorite bear, Mr. Buttons, when the first knock came, sharp and sudden, rattling the kitchen windows and making the dog bark frantically, and there she was, Karen, standing at the threshold in her perfectly ironed blouse and tight skirt, an expression of feigned concern on her angular face, though the coldness in her eyes betrayed her true intent. And without waiting for an invitation, she stepped onto the porch, her heels clicking ominously on the pavement as she surveyed the Thompson home like a predator assessing its prey, her voice smooth yet edged with malice as she demanded to inspect Emily's garden, claiming that the flowers Emily had planted last week were not up to HOA standards. And while Linda tried to politely explain that Emily had planted them herself as part of her therapy routine, Karen's laughter, sharp and grating, cut through the morning air, sending a shiver down Emily's spine, who instinctively hugged Mr. Buttons tighter, her heart pounding as she felt a familiar sense of dread creeping up her chest. And then Karen's gaze shifted, piercing and calculating, settling on Emily, and in that instant the cheerful sunlight seemed to dim, the warmth of the morning replaced by a cold, oppressive tension that filled the room, making Emily's small body tremble as she realized, even if only subconsciously, that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine, and Linda, sensing the growing danger, stepped forward, her voice firm but quivering, demanding that Karen respect their property, her hands gripping the edge of the kitchen counter as if anchoring herself against an invisible storm. Yet Karen, unmoved, continued her relentless inspection, moving closer to Emily with a predatory precision that made the little girl shrink in her wheelchair, clutching the armrests as if they could shield her from the impending threat, and every word Karen spoke dripped with condescension, mocking Emily's efforts, ridiculing the bright flowers, and insinuating that the family was incapable of maintaining proper order. And as Emily's tears began to well, blurring her vision, Mark slammed his hand down on the table, his anger barely contained as he demanded that Karen leave immediately, his voice rising, echoing off the walls. But Karen, with a smile that could have cut glass, refused, claiming she had authority over every inch of the neighborhood, her tone both patronizing and sinister. And then, as if testing the limits of her power, she reached out and grabbed Emily's wheelchair, shaking it ever so slightly, sending the little girl's stuffed animals tumbling to the floor, her cries filling the air, the sound of her panic bouncing off the walls and searing itself into the hearts of her parents. And in that moment, Linda lunged forward to pull Karen back, the room erupting into chaos as neighbors peered through their windows, drawn by the commotion, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others whispering quietly to themselves, wondering how one woman could wield so much terror over a young child and her family. And yet Karen, undeterred by the witnesses or the pleas, leaned in closer to Emily, her words low, venomous, and threatening, hinting that this was only the beginning, that Emily would learn what it meant to be controlled and corrected under her watchful eye. And though Emily's body quivered and tears streamed down her face, there was a flicker in her eyes, a spark of resilience that refused to be extinguished, and even as Karen finally stormed off, leaving a trail of bitterness and fear in her wake, the damage had been done. Emily was left trembling, clutching Mr. Buttons to her chest, while her parents exchanged worried glances, knowing that the encounter was not an isolated incident, but the opening salvo in a war that would test the limits of their courage, love, and determination. And as the morning sun continued to rise, its light now muted by the shadow Karen had cast, Emily whispered a promise to herself, her small voice trembling but firm, that she would not let fear define her, that somehow, even against the cruelty of Karen Whitmore, she would find strength, and it was in that fragile yet powerful moment that the first chapter of an unimaginable story began, a tale filled with pain, resilience, and suspense, one that would grip anyone who witnessed it leaving, hearts racing, tears streaming, and minds unable to turn away, for the Thompson family, and especially Emily, had just stepped onto a path that would forever change their lives, and the audience, drawn into this intimate yet terrifying world, could already feel the pull of the story's momentum, knowing that what started as a seemingly ordinary morning would escalate into a battle of wills, courage, and survival unlike anything they had ever imagined. The days following Karen Whitmore's first terrifying intrusion into the Thompson household felt like walking on shards of glass, each moment laced with an unspoken threat that made Emily Thompson's fragile heart pound relentlessly. And though she tried to resume her daily routine, the memory of Karen's cold, calculating eyes and the way her wheelchair had been shaken over the floor haunted every step she took, her small hands clutching Mr. Buttons as if the stuffed bear alone could shield her from the looming storm, while her parents, Linda and Mark, worked tirelessly to restore a sense of safety that seemed to vanish with each passing sunrise, their anxiety mounting as Karen's shadow lingered not only in their minds but in the neighborhood itself, whispers following them from the mailboxes, disapproving glances from behind curtains, subtle signs that Karen's reach extended far beyond their front door. And then, one overcast afternoon, the nightmare returned with a vengeance. Emily had wheeled herself into the driveway, carefully maneuvering around the garden that she had spent weeks cultivating, the vibrant blooms a testament to her resilience and love for life, when Karen suddenly appeared as if conjured from the gray clouds above, her heels striking the pavement with the precision of a predator stalking prey, a twisted smile curling across her face as she surveyed Emily with a mixture of amusement and malice. And before anyone could react, Karen's hand shot out, grabbing Emily's shoulder with a strength that belied her frail appearance, yanking her wheelchair violently, sending the small girl tipping to the side, the air expelled from her lungs in a sharp gasp as her head struck the edge of the driveway, and blood, bright and shocking against her pale skin, began to trickle down her cheek, mixing with tears that burned at her eyes, and the world seemed to pause, neighbors frozen in shock, cars halting mid-street, the dog barking incessantly, all as Emily's cries pierced the air, a sound so raw and filled with pain that it made Linda's knees buckle and Mark's fists clench uncontrollably, and yet Karen, unflinching, merely stepped back, her eyes gleaming with cruel satisfaction, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment, relishing every second of terror she had inflicted. And in that instant, Emily felt an intense wave of fear, humiliation, and helplessness crash over her, the world narrowing to the sting of blood on her face and the overwhelming presence of a woman who had made it her mission to dominate and destroy. And though the pain was sharp, a strange clarity pierced through the haze of shock, an ember of defiance flickering in Emily's heart, for she understood, in that terrifying second, that she could not allow Karen to define her life or break her spirit. And as she attempted to steady herself, her tears blurring her vision, Linda rushed to her side, cradling her daughter with a protective ferocity that matched the intensity of the storm raging in her own chest, yelling at Karen to leave, her voice cracking yet resolute, while Mark scrambled to call the authorities, the line trembling in his hand as he described the assault, knowing that words alone could never capture the sheer malevolence of the act. And Karen, impervious to the rising chaos, tilted her head, scanning the scene like a chess master considering her next move, before finally turning on her heel, her departure slow and deliberate, leaving Emily in a puddle of tears and blood, her body shaking from both physical pain and the terror that had gripped her soul. And in the aftermath, the Thompson home became a place of quiet but unbearable tension, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside the window, a reminder of Karen's lurking presence. And as Emily sat in her wheelchair, her face still stinging from the brutal encounter, she whispered promises of courage to herself, her small voice unwavering even in the shadow of trauma, knowing that she had survived this first true strike and that survival itself was a form of resistance, while her parents, hearts heavy yet burning with protective rage, began to strategize, plotting ways to shield their daughter, document every move of Karen's increasingly violent behavior, and prepare for the inevitable next encounter, a battle of wills and courage that was rapidly escalating beyond neighborhood squabbles into a full-blown nightmare. And in that charged atmosphere, tension thickened like smoke in the air, suspense dangling over every action and word, as even the neighbors who had once turned blind eyes now watched with growing apprehension, murmuring about the cruelty they had just witnessed, feeling a mixture of sympathy and fear. Because Karen's reach and vindictiveness were undeniable, her ability to torment seemingly limitless, and as evening fell, painting the sky in muted shades of gray and crimson, Emily sat quietly in her room, the blood on her face slowly cleaned, yet the sting lingering as a visceral reminder of the day's horror, and though her body ached and her spirit trembled, there was also a seed planted deep within her, a fierce determination to not be broken, to rise despite the cruelty, to face the darkness with as much bravery as she could muster, while Linda and Mark, exhausted but resolute, exchanged silent nods, a wordless agreement that they would not let Karen's terror define their lives, and in that moment the stage was set for the storm to escalate further, the tension building like a tightly wound coil, ready to snap, each second carrying the weight of potential disaster, every glance from the street a potential threat, every creak in the night a possible sign of Karen's return. And as the family huddled together, the audience, already drawn into the gripping narrative, could feel their pulse quicken, hearts pounding with fear, empathy, and anticipation, because the story was far from over, the next move unpredictable, and the suspense unbearable, leaving viewers on edge, fully immersed in the harrowing yet empowering journey of Emily Thompson, a young girl whose courage was about to be tested like never before. The morning after Emily Thompson's terrifying encounter with Karen Whitmore, the Thompson household was a fragile blend of exhaustion, fear, and simmering determination, the memory of blood and tears from the previous day etched into every corner of their minds. And yet, despite the pain and trauma, there was no surrender in Emily's gaze, only a quiet, defiant strength that shone through as she sat in her wheelchair by the window, tracing the outlines of her garden with trembling fingers, while her parents, Linda and Mark, huddled over a table cluttered with papers, HOA documents, and photographs of the previous day's assault, their eyes scanning for legal avenues, supportive neighbors, or any possible leverage to finally protect their daughter. And as they whispered strategies to one another, the weight of the decision pressed heavily on their shoulders, because confronting Karen Whitmore directly meant stepping into a world of intimidation, harassment, and potential danger. Yet, allowing her to continue unchecked would be an admission of helplessness they refused to grant, and Emily, overhearing fragments of their conversation, felt a rush of hope and fear intertwining within her, realizing that she was not alone, that her parents' love was a fortress, even if the threat outside their walls remained relentless. And then, the first ripple of resistance began to form when the family decided to discreetly record every interaction with Karen, documenting her increasingly aggressive behavior, her invasive inspections, and her veiled threats, a meticulous plan designed not only to protect Emily legally, but to expose the depth of her cruelty to the neighborhood. While at the same time, Emily herself, small yet resolute, began to practice subtle acts of defiance, wheelchair maneuvers, careful positioning in the yard, and even rehearsed responses that could assert her presence without escalating the situation unnecessarily, a combination of strategy and courage that would make her less of a target in Karen's eyes, yet still maintain the essence of her independent spirit. And as days turned into weeks, tension grew like a dark cloud over Willow Creek, neighbors whispering in hushed tones, some expressing sympathy, others fearing reprisal, and all the while, Karen continued to patrol her self-declared territory, her eyes sharp and judgmental, her footsteps deliberate, as if she could sense the family's quiet plotting and was already calculating ways to preempt any resistance. And in those moments of silent observation, Emily's mind wandered to moments of normalcy she had lost, playing in the sun, laughing with friends, feeling safe in her own home. And though the loss was painful, it ignited a fire within her, a determination to reclaim what had been stolen, to turn fear into power, to transform vulnerability into strength. And her parents, watching her small but resolute figure, felt both pride and anguish, knowing that the coming battle would test not only Emily's courage but their own, because standing up to Karen Whitmore was not merely about one confrontation, it was a prolonged campaign against a woman who thrived on control and intimidation, a campaign that required precision, patience, and unwavering resolve. And as they continued to strategize, a small group of neighbors, emboldened by what they had witnessed and inspired by the Thompson family's quiet bravery, began offering discreet support, watching for Karen's moves, providing testimony, and creating a subtle network of resistance that, if coordinated carefully, could tip the scales in the family's favor. While Emily, unaware of all the behind-the-scenes work, felt a growing sense of agency, practicing her words, learning to steady her breathing, and visualizing herself confronting Karen not as a victim, but as someone who would not bow to cruelty. And it was in these small, almost imperceptible moments of preparation that the suspense built to a near intolerable level, because the audience could feel the tension crackling in the air, every look from the street, every knock on the door, every rustle outside becoming a potential prelude to disaster, yet also a setup for triumph, a delicate balance of fear and hope. And one afternoon, as Emily wheeled herself to the garden, carefully tending to the flowers that had once been the focus of Karen's ridicule, she noticed movement at the corner of the property, Karen, as always, appearing. Suddenly, her expression calculating, her eyes sharp as she assessed Emily with a predator's intensity, and in that heartbeat, the stakes became crystal clear. Any misstep could lead to another assault, yet any moment of hesitation would reinforce Karen's control, and Emily, drawing a deep breath, positioned herself deliberately, practiced defiance radiating in every gesture, while Linda and Mark, watching from the window, exchanged anxious glances, hearts racing, knowing that the confrontation was imminent. Yet also knowing that this time, it would not be unplanned or reactive. It would be deliberate, recorded, and witnessed, a carefully choreographed act of resistance that had been months in making. And as Karen stepped closer, her heels clicking against the pavement like the ticking of a clock counting down to some inevitable chaos, Emily felt a surge of adrenaline, her pulse quickening, muscles tensing, mind sharpening. And in that moment, the audience, fully immersed in the story, could feel the intensity of the standoff, the suspense, the uncertainty, the hope, and the fear, all mingling into a visceral emotional cocktail that demanded attention, because they knew, as Emily did, that the next encounter could define everything, that her courage, preparation, and the support of those around her would be tested in ways beyond imagination, and the tension, like a coiled spring, was about to snap, setting the stage for a series of confrontations, revelations, and moments of raw, heart-wrenching drama that would leave viewers breathless, fully engaged, and emotionally invested in the unfolding saga of Emily Thompson, a girl whose pain had been exposed to the world, whose courage was quietly growing, and whose family, united and unbroken, was preparing to face the relentless storm named Karen Whitmore. With every word, glance, and action dripping with suspense, anticipation, and the unshakable promise that the story's trajectory was about to shift from fear to resistance, from victimhood to empowerment, and from quiet suffering to an electrifying confrontation that would captivate and haunt audiences in equal measure. The tension that had been simmering in Willow Creek for weeks finally reached a boiling point as Karen Whitmore, sensing that her usual intimidation tactics were losing their grip on Emily Thompson, escalated her cruelty in ways that made the neighborhood hold its collective breath. And it began one overcast afternoon when Emily was wheeling herself down the driveway, carefully tending to her small garden of vibrant flowers that had become both her sanctuary and symbol of defiance, when Karen appeared suddenly at the end of the driveway, her face twisted in a cruel smirk, her heels clacking sharply against the concrete like the drumbeat of impending doom. And this time, she had brought with her a group of neighbors who had always looked up to her authority, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unspoken approval of her dominance. And as Emily froze in her wheelchair, Gripping Mr. Buttons tightly, Karen raised her voice, mocking the little girl's efforts, questioning the placement of every flower, ridiculing every careful arrangement as though the plants themselves were an affront to her superiority. And when Emily tried to respond softly, explaining that this was her therapy and something that brought her joy, Karen's laughter rang out like shattering glass, cruel and merciless, drawing the attention of more neighbors who had begun to gather, some whispering, some staring silently, their eyes reflecting shock, disbelief, and the quiet horror of what they were witnessing. And then, with a sudden, terrifying force, Karen lunged forward, yanking the wheelchair with both hands, sending Emily tipping violently, her body crashing to the concrete with a sickening thud, the sound echoing down the street as blood began to trickle from her scraped and bruised face, her cries ripping through the air, raw and full of pain, and though Linda and Mark sprinted her side, hearts pounding, rage boiling in every vein, the crowd of onlookers did little to intervene, paralyzed by fear or indecision, and Karen, undeterred by the chaos she had wrought, straightened herself, the picture of cold, calculated arrogance, as if every gasp, every tear, every desperate plea only fueled her sadistic satisfaction, and Emily, tears streaming down her face, struggled to sit up, her hands trembling. Yet even through the pain, there was a glimmer of defiance in her eyes, a tiny spark that refused to be snuffed out, and her parents, cradling her carefully, whispered reassurances, their voices laced with both fury and love, promising her that they would not let Karen destroy them, that they had documented everything, recorded witnesses, and would take every possible step to protect her, while the neighbors, some finally finding courage, began murmuring about calling authorities, about reporting the assault. But Karen, sensing the threat to her untouchable image, waved them off with a sharp glance, her tone icy and commanding, asserting that she had the right to enforce the HOA rules and that anyone interfering would face consequences. And in that moment, the street felt like a battlefield, tension crackling in the air, every eye on Karen and the Thompson family, every heartbeat syncing with Emily's, and the suspense was almost unbearable as the audience, fully immersed in the scene, could feel the fear, the rage, and the silent calculation building with every passing second, and then, as if the encounter had not been enough, Karen, still smirking, picked up a fallen potted plant and hurled it across the driveway, shattering it against the garage door, dirt and debris scattering, narrowly missing Emily. And the sound of the impact made her jump in terror, her body shaking, and it became clear that Karen's cruelty had no bounds, that she thrived on public humiliation as much as physical dominance, and that the Thompson family was facing not just a single adversary, but a relentless force that would stop at nothing to assert power and control. Yet even amidst the horror, a plan began to crystallize in Linda and Mark's minds, a way to use Karen's arrogance against her, to document, to record, to set up a situation where her cruelty could be exposed to the authorities and the neighborhood in a way that could no longer be ignored. And Emily, watching her parents quietly coordinate while simultaneously enduring the fear and pain of the moment, felt a surge of courage rise from deep within, her pulse racing, her mind sharpening, her eyes narrowing. With determination, realizing that though Karen had the physical advantage, she did not have control over Emily's spirit, nor could she dictate the strength of the bond between a family united against injustice, and as Karen finally retreated, tossing another condescending glare over her shoulder, the street remained thick with tension, whispers of horror mixing with cautious hope, because everyone present could sense that this was no longer a mere HOA dispute, but the beginning of a war of wills, courage, and strategy, and the suspense was palpable, the audience feeling every scrape, every scream, every heartbeat of Emily as if it were their own, fully invested in the outcome, their emotions entwined with the Thompson family's struggle, knowing that the next move, whether by Karen or by Emily and her parents, would set the tone for the battles yet to come, the stakes higher than ever, the danger imminent, and the story accelerating toward a climax so emotionally charged, so suspenseful, and so gripping that viewers could not imagine looking away, compelled to witness every moment of fear, every spark of defiance, and every step in the delicate dance between cruelty and courage that defined the unfolding saga of Emily Thompson, a young girl whose pain, resilience, and growing empowerment would keep audiences on edge, hearts racing, tears flowing, and minds unable to predict what horrifying or triumphant moment might come next in the relentless shadow cast by Karen Whitmore. The day that Emily Thompson had both feared and anticipated for weeks finally arrived, a gray, windswept morning that seemed to reflect the storm brewing in her chest, and she wheeled herself cautiously toward the front yard, every instinct screaming that Karen Whitmore would be waiting, and she was not wrong. There, at the end of the driveway, Karen stood like a sentinel of cruelty, her arms crossed, lips curled in that cold, infuriating smirk that had haunted Emily's nightmares, while the air seemed to thrum with tension, every leaf rustling as if whispering warnings of what was to come. And as Emily approached, her parents, Linda and Mark, hovered nearby, hearts pounding, ready to intervene, yet knowing that this moment required careful orchestration because they had learned that reacting recklessly only fueled Karen's dominance, and Emily, gripping the wheels of her chair with trembling hands, fixed her gaze on Karen, her eyes sharp and unyielding, a mix of fear, anger, and newfound determination radiating from her small frame. And as Karen took a step forward, voice dripping with condescension and mock sympathy, lecturing Emily on proper behavior, and respecting HOA rules, a shiver of dread rippled through the gathered neighbors who had come to watch the spectacle, some whispering in disbelief, others frozen by the sheer audacity of Karen's public cruelty. Yet, even in the midst of terror, Emily felt something stir inside her, a spark of defiance that had been nurtured over the past weeks, the countless small acts of courage, the support of her parents, and the secret knowledge that Karen's arrogance could be turned against her, and in a heartbeat, Emily executed a move she had practiced countless times in her mind, positioning her wheelchair strategically, speaking clearly and firmly, not just as a victim, but as someone who would not be intimidated, and the words struck Karen with unexpected force, a combination of confidence and righteous anger that momentarily froze her, her smirk faltering, eyes narrowing as if trying to calculate the shift in power, and it was in that suspended second that Linda and Mark acted, documenting the confrontation with phones and discreet cameras, neighbors whispering encouragement while still wary of Karen's unpredictable reactions, and Karen, realizing that her control was slipping, suddenly lunged forward, grabbing Emily's chair in a violent attempt to dominate her once more. But Emily, anticipating this move, braced herself, her small body tense, and the chair remained steady, refusing to tip under Karen's weight, while Linda rushed to stand beside her daughter, voice shaking but resolute, warning Karen to back off, the sound echoing like a drumbeat of defiance down the quiet street, and for a tense moment, it seemed as though the air itself held its breath, the world suspended between fear and the potential for triumph. And then, as Karen's fury erupted in a flurry of threats and insults, Emily executed the final part of her silent plan. She spoke up loudly enough for every neighbor present to hear, recounting Karen's assaults, threats, and humiliations, while Linda and Mark showed the photographic and video evidence they had been gathering, each image, each clip, a damning testament to the cruelty that Karen had inflicted, and the crowd, finally awakening from their paralysis, gasped, murmured, and whispered, some recording the scene on their phones, ensuring that Karen's actions would no longer be shrouded in intimidation and secrecy, and Karen, her face blanching with a mix of shock, rage, and disbelief, realized that her long-standing reign of terror was unraveling in front of witnesses, the power she had wielded with such confidence slipping through her fingers like sand, and Emily, feeling the culmination of weeks of preparation, pain, and fear, felt a surge of empowerment unlike anything she had experienced, tears still streaking her cheeks, but now mingled with a fierce joy, because for the first time, she was no longer the helpless target of Karen's cruelty, she was an active force in her own story. And as Karen stumbled back, her voice rising with desperate threats that now fell on deaf ears, Emily's parents held her close, whispering words of pride and reassurance, while the neighbors, some teary-eyed, some shocked into silent awe, began to murmur support and admiration. And in that moment, the gray morning seemed to brighten the oppressive, tension lifting slightly, replaced by a palpable sense of victory, And yet the suspense remained because while Karen had been exposed, she was far from defeated, her temper volatile, her next move unpredictable, and the audience completely absorbed in the harrowing confrontation, could feel every heartbeat, every breath, every shiver of fear and thrill, fully aware that the climax of Emily's struggle was not merely the confrontation itself, but the culmination of courage, strategy, and unyielding family unity, the suspense now electrified by the knowledge that true justice and empowerment required vigilance, resilience, and unwavering courage. And as Emily, small but unbroken, wheeled herself back toward the safety of her home, head held high, parents at her side, the world seemed momentarily to exhale, but the story, fully charged with emotion, suspense, and intensity, had only reached the pivot point, preparing the audience for the next wave of tension, resolution, and catharsis, a narrative so gripping that hearts raced, eyes welled, and every viewer was left on the edge of their seat, knowing that Emily Thompson's journey through fear, cruelty, and ultimate courage was far from over. Yet the triumph of this moment would forever resonate as a testament to resilience, strategy, and the unbreakable bond of family standing against relentless cruelty, with Karen Whitmore's shadow looming. But no longer omnipotent, her power fractured by the indomitable spirit of a young girl who refused to be broken. The tension that had gripped Willow Creek for weeks reached a boiling point as the Thompson family, armed with meticulous documentation, recordings, and the unwavering courage of Emily Thompson, finally began to see the tide turn against Karen Whitmore, whose arrogance and cruelty, once seemingly untouchable, started to unravel in a way that left the neighborhood and herself reeling. And it all began on a crisp morning when the local HOA board convened for a scheduled meeting, unsuspecting that the Thompson family had prepared a carefully orchestrated presentation, complete with photographic evidence, video footage of Karen's assaults, and eyewitness accounts from neighbors who had been too afraid to speak until now. And as the room filled with the murmurs of curious and anxious residents, Emily sat quietly beside her parents, her wheelchair positioned with confidence, her small hands gripping the wheels not in fear, but in determination, and the moment the floor opened for testimony, Linda stepped forward first, her voice steady yet charged with emotion as she recounted the first terrifying incidents, including the assault in the driveway, the shaking of Emily's wheelchair, and the public humiliation that had made their family feel trapped and helpless, while Mark displayed the photos and videos that captured Karen's escalating aggression. The once pristine image of HOA authority shattered in front of a room that had long admired her control, and Emily, sensing that the culmination of months of fear and planning rested in her voice, spoke softly but clearly, recounting the terror she had endured, the pain of each assault, and the courage it had taken to stand up. And as she did, the atmosphere in the room shifted palpably, a mixture of shock, horror, and reluctant admiration washing over the witnesses, while Karen, seated rigidly at the front, her posture strained, lips pressed tight, tried to interject with thinly veiled denials and the same condescending tone she had wielded for so long, but her words fell flat, drowned out by the overwhelming evidence and the moral weight of Emily's testimony, and as the HOA board reviewed the materials, their expressions, unreadable at first, a slow but undeniable change began to appear. Their respect for Karen's authority eroded by the clarity and undeniability of the truth. Neighbors who had once whispered quietly now nodded, some wiping tears from their eyes, others murmuring support as Karen's power, once a looming and oppressive presence, began to fracture. And in the midst of the room's silent recognition of the injustice, a legal representative stepped forward, outlining the implications of Emily's documentation and the potential for official action, including the possibility of criminal charges, civil suits, and immediate revocation of Karen's HOA privileges. And the crowd, sensing the shift in momentum, began to whisper, exchange glances, and murmur approval, while Karen, face pale and eyes wide with disbelief, realized with a sinking horror that her carefully cultivated image of control was crumbling, that the consequences she had long evaded were now tangible, imminent, and irreversible, and Emily, watching the unraveling before her, felt an overwhelming mixture of relief, pride and cautious anticipation, her small frame trembling not from fear this time, but from the emotional weight of witnessing justice take its first steps, and as the meeting concluded with Karen, escorted out under the watchful eyes of HOA board members and neighbors who had finally found the courage to stand against her, the Thompson family wheeled Emily back to the safety of their home, hearts racing, tears streaking their faces, laughter and sobs mingling as the realization that the nightmare was finally being confronted sank in, and while the physical scars on Emily's face remained as stark reminders of the cruelty she had endured, the emotional and psychological victory was undeniable, a testament to the power of preparation, courage, and the unwavering support of family. And even as they celebrated quietly, Linda and Mark knew the journey was not entirely over. Karen's presence, once a shadow over every moment, was diminished but not completely gone, and the suspense remained as a subtle undercurrent, a reminder that vigilance was necessary, that the community had a role to play in ensuring that such cruelty could never return unchecked. And in those quiet moments, Emily, still small and fragile in appearance but immense in spirit, whispered promises to herself about strength, resilience, and the importance of standing up to injustice, while her parents enveloped her in hugs, their pride and relief interwoven with lingering concern, and the audience fully invested in the story's harrowing journey could feel every beat, every heartbeat of tension and triumph. The emotional catharsis tempered by lingering suspense, knowing that while Karen Whitmore had been exposed and consequences were now inevitable, the story's impact on Emily, her family, and the neighborhood would ripple long after the final gavel had fallen, leaving viewers gripped, emotionally charged, and eagerly awaiting the final chapter of Emily's journey toward full empowerment, healing, and the restoration of peace in a world that had once been shadowed by cruelty. As the narrative balanced the sweet taste of justice with the lingering tension of a lingering threat, ensuring that the audience remained fully captivated, their hearts aligned with the triumphs and fears of the Thompson family, knowing that courage, love, and strategy had prevailed against a relentless adversary, but that vigilance and resilience were the true markers of ultimate victory. The days following Karen Whitmore's public exposure brought a delicate calm to the Thompson household, a quiet that was both unfamiliar and deeply treasured. Yet beneath the surface lingered the faint echoes of past terror, reminding Emily Thompson, her parents Linda and Mark, and even the neighbors who had witnessed the ordeal, that the scars of cruelty do not vanish overnight, and Emily, now moving through the rooms of her home with cautious confidence, felt a sense of strength blossoming. Within her, small but unwavering, the courage she had nurtured over weeks of fear, preparation, and defiance now crystallized into a resolve that radiated from every gesture, every glance, and every word she spoke, and her parents, watching her navigate the spaces that had once felt dangerous, their hearts both heavy and light, marveled at the transformation. Their pride mingled with a persistent anxiety born from the memory of Karen's relentless aggression, knowing that vigilance would always be necessary, but also recognizing that their daughter had become something far more powerful than anyone had anticipated, a symbol of resilience in the face of unrelenting cruelty. And as Emily wheeled herself into the front yard, carefully tending to the flowers that had once been the catalyst for Karen's assaults, a group of neighbors gathered quietly, offering smiles, words of encouragement, and small gestures of solidarity, the collective acknowledgement of her strength reinforcing the reality that fear no longer had dominion over her life, and though Karen's presence still lingered as a cautionary shadow, her power diminished, fractured, and largely neutralized by the courage, documentation, and support that had finally brought justice to the situation. And as Emily recounted to her parents the small victories of her day, the laughter of children in the neighborhood, the quiet gestures of kindness from formerly timid neighbors, and her own ability to move with confidence. Without fear, Linda and Mark felt a weight lift from their shoulders, the months of tension and sleepless nights yielding, however gradually, to a sense of relief and hope, while the audience, fully absorbed in the journey, could feel The layered emotional impact, the lingering pain of past trauma, the thrill of justice served, and the profound satisfaction of witnessing courage triumph over cruelty, and Emily, reflecting quietly in her room one evening, traced the bruises that had faded but not disappeared on her arms and face, feeling the physical reminders of her ordeal. Yet more importantly, she felt the invisible scars of fear being replaced by resilience, a newfound belief in her own strength, and the comforting knowledge that her family, her allies, and even the community she had once feared now stood with her, ready to protect, support, and celebrate her as a living testament to courage under pressure. And as the night settled over Willow Creek, the Thompson family sat, together on the porch, holding hands, sharing quiet laughter and soft tears, the emotional catharsis palpable in the gentle breeze that stirred the flowers Emily had so carefully planted, and even as they savored the triumph of surviving, confronting, and outsmarting a relentless adversary, there was an acknowledgement of the fragility of peace, a subtle suspense that reminded viewers that life's battles, though won, leave lasting impressions, shaping the character, resolve, and heart of those who endure them. And Emily, small yet monumental in her spirit, whispered into the evening air a promise to herself that she would continue to grow, to stand tall despite adversity, and to protect not only herself, but others who might face cruelty in hidden forms, her words carrying a profound resonance for the audience, an emotional echo that elevated the narrative from a mere story of victimhood to one of enduring empowerment, community, and the transformative power of courage. And as the camera of imagination or the eyes of the audience lingered on the Thompson family, hearts intertwined, spirits lifted, yet forever marked by the events that had tested their very souls, it became clear that Emily Thompson was no longer merely a victim of Karen Whitmore's tyranny. She had become a beacon of resilience, a symbol of hope and determination that could not be extinguished, and the story, having carried viewers through terror, suspense, emotional highs and lows, and ultimate triumph, left them with a lingering sense of awe, a deep emotional connection, and the satisfying knowledge that even in the face of unthinkable cruelty, courage, preparation, and love can transform fear into empowerment, leaving hearts racing, eyes teary, and minds captivated, fully invested in the journey of a young girl who faced darkness and emerged stronger, her story echoing long after the final words, a testament to resilience, justice, and the unbreakable bonds of family that would remain in the audience's memory as both inspiration and a reminder of the enduring power of courage in the face of relentless adversity.